welcome back to another episode of More Than Kurosawa. And this week we're going to be looking at the film The Warped Ones, one of the most iconic Japanese New Wave films, while also talking a bit about the director, Kiyoshi Kurahara. But if you're new to this series, what I do every single week is pick and review a different Asian movie by a different Asian director every week to try to help us understand the wide world of Asian cinema, that there is great Asian cinema, more than Akira Kurosawa or Hayao Miyazaki or maybe some other names and filmmakers you've seen before. That's why every week we're picking a different great movie by a different director to show you that there's so many great options out there. So if you have seen the movie and if you like this director, maybe you can check out some of their other movies. These videos are meant to be great starting points for you onto your journey from someone who has learned a little bit about it myself. But what we're going to be doing today is similar to what we've done in past episodes. Break the video up into two parts. The first part looking at why I decided to pick this director to cover, since this is the only opportunity we're going to have to talk about them. And then the second half of the video, more of an in-depth, deep dive into the movie itself, why I think it's a good starting point, and what makes it kind of a special, unique film and different than some of the other movies we've covered in the past, and helps us understand that there's different types of movies. There's optimistic, there's nihilistic, there's intense, there's slow, there's kind of all these different types, and every week we try to mix things up and zig and zag to show you the different types of options that are out there from many great directors. So starting off with my thoughts on the filmmaker and why I want to cover Kiyoshi Kurahara. And that's because I want to talk more about the Japanese New Wave. We mentioned this a couple weeks ago on the Vengeance is Mine episode. That director, Shohei Imamura, was also, directly correlated to the Japanese New Wave. But the movie we covered on that week's episode, Vengeance is Mine, was, made in the 70s, much later, past the Japanese New Wave. It was much more of a mature film for Imamura, a great film. But while we talked about his role in the New Wave in the discussion part of that video, the movie we covered ultimately didn't have a lot of those hallmarks. So this week I wanted to cover another Japanese New Wave director, not rehash what we discussed on that episode in terms of the history and what it meant, but actually review a film that was more in line with the types of films that were being made at that time. Just a brief synopsis of that video. Japanese New Wave, very similar to the French New Wave happening in the 60s. Young people making movies about the times, oftentimes starring other young people, kind of breaking the rules of cinema, lots of editing, moving camera, shooting outside, as I mentioned, and kind of an energetic sense of filmmaking from young people, which helped revitalize and showcase another side of Asian cinema, in particular in Japan, in the sense of Japanese New Wave. So you can get my thoughts on The Warped Ones a little bit later on in the video when we discuss the film itself. You can check the description for the timestamps if you want to just jump ahead to that. So that's one reason why I wanted to cover him. I thought that it would be interesting to cover another specific Japanese New Wave film. But then also I wanted to cover a director that I didn't full stop love. A lot of these videos, I've seen a lot of the director's movies, and at the very least like a lot of them. But this week I wanted to cover a director who I'm kind of mixed on, who can make some really great movies, but has also made some poor ones as well. And ultimately, if this series is meant to be a comprehensive look of Asian cinema, it'd be almost disingenuous for me to say, oh yeah, every week there's a new Asian master and they've got 10 great movies and you should check out all of them. Because that's not the case in, Western cinema. Kurahara is a director like Jonathan Demme or William Friedkin, where they've made some great movies, but they've also made some stinkers, and there is some highs and lows within the career. And not all of the movies that Kurahara has made I can recommend, but he still has a very fascinating filmography, a long filmography where he does a bunch of different types of genres, but he still has that directorial flourish and that style. He'll make, a movie like Intimidation, which is pretty much straight up noir, and then in the same year make The Warped Ones, and that's much more freewheeling, kind of a jazz coming-of-age movie. And then he'll do, a classic adaptation of a novel in Thirst for Love, and that's completely different. And then he'll eventually go and do, nature-type movies, almost with like Antarctica. So he's a fascinating director, but I still think he's got that strong style throughout all of his movies. He's more so like a Martin Scorsese than he is a Ron Howard, in that if you've seen Scorsese's Age of Innocence, it's undoubtedly a period movie, but it still feels like in his camera work and subject matter, the same director as the guy who did After Hours. But when you look at a movie like, let's say with Ron Howard, Far and Away, it's almost surprising that the guy who directed that also directed Rush. Now, that's good for Ron Howard. I do think he's a great chameleon in that sense, but Kurahara is not that necessarily. Even if he's making a straight noir, whether it be the themes or whether it be the actual camera work and the style that he places upon, his acting style, his directing style, things like that, they're very still distinctive amongst all his films, which is exciting because when you start watching a lot of his movies, you can pick up certain things. One thing that I picked up on is he really loves using long lenses. And that's because his characters are always moving. They're always going to somewhere. I think that connects more so to his thematic interests. Thematically, throughout all of his movies, he's interested in social status and interactions between upper and lower class people and their different kind of cultures and the clashing of those cultures. But then also, there's almost always a character who's trying to move up into another social status or try to get better. We can talk about that a little bit more in The Warped Ones. But there's always this idea of social status and social class, which is interesting because some of his peers at the time were a little bit older than him. In Mizoguchi or Kurosawa or Ugetsu, they're also interested in these themes. It is a kind of traditional Japanese interest, whether it be even novels or cinema, this idea of kind of social standing and class. The difference between a filmmaker like Mizoguchi and Kurahara is their camera work and their technical styles. Mizoguchi is much more still, kind of gliding camera work, where Kurahara is much more handheld, frenetic. Mizoguchi, let's say, oftentimes in period pieces. Kurahara has done his share of period pieces, but oftentimes they're set contemporary, they're shot outside, there is an improvisational aspect to it. So his themes are very classical, those themes of classism, but his technical mastery is what you start to see and start to pick up on when we're talking about a thing like style. So he has the classicism and the interest in class, and then his style through his camera work. I mentioned the long lenses because his characters are always traveling, going from one place to another, and that's a really effective technique because we're so kind of focused in, and the actual focus of the camera is within the character, but because we're using long lenses, any kind of slight movement of the camera, the background really kind of whips by relatively quickly, so that adds that sense of energy and excitement. And he knows when to use and when to not. It's much more active in a movie like The Warped Ones, but even in a classical period piece like Thirst for Love, to kind of emphasize some of those more dramatic emotions, he will use like the sweeping camera with these long lenses so that it feels like we're kind of moving great distances and that the character is traveling through space, and which I mentioned is therefore connected to the overall theme of a character going from one place to another, trying to increase their social status or trying to do something to increase their social status. Kurahara is much more interested in the people on screen and less so in the background. It's more so where they're going, not where they've been. So as a result, the visual style, I think, mirrors that very well. So that's a little bit why I wanted to discover Kurahara, and I can recommend some of his films. Intimidation, I Am Waiting. And then less so ones like maybe Thirst for Love or Antarctica, I think, are maybe less successful, still interesting, and you can still, like I said, pick up on that style. But my favorite of his movies, I think, would be The Warped Ones. So jumping over now into my discussion on that film. If you haven't seen the movie, it's about this trio of young people, Japanese youth, two guys and a girl who've just been released out of kind of like a jail/juvie, and how their lives kind of entangle with the people that put them there, the journalists, and where that story goes from there. Somewhat twisty and turny, but for the most part it reminds me of a movie like Harmony Korine's movies, like Kids or Spring Breakers. There is a true sense of meandering, of lawlessness. And there was a term that I found doing some reading and some critical thoughts on this movie and Kurahara's movies in general, that really jumped out to me, which was muko koseki, which is a Japanese term, which I botched, but kind of relatively means borderless action, and that we can refer to other types of Japanese movies, but I definitely think it applies to this movie in particular. I thought that was a great kind of word to use to describe the movie and to help you understand it, is this sense of borderlessness. You don't know where the story is going to go. You kind of just latch onto these characters and you hold on for dear life. This is a movie about characters in transience, about characters trying to find themselves, about youthful people kind of having these animalistic tendencies and going wherever. And that borderlessness and that freeness almost to the story feels much more like a day in the life than it is an actual plot, that things happen, that we're not necessarily trying to predict what's going to happen, we're just along for the ride. And that's what the story is trying to tell us. And the filmmaking style is absolutely that. Use of jazz, so it's very kind of intense and improvisational, like jazz is itself. Like I mentioned in the past, Kurahara shoots a lot of this outside, so we're on location, we're kind of moving with the characters with handheld cameras or tracking shots. The editing is rapid and quick. This is only a 75-minute movie. There's always a sense of forward momentum. We're going from one scene to the next and it just snowballs, and that pace kind of maintains very impressively, I think, throughout that 75-minute stretch. But then the subject matter itself is very intense. So it's a perfect marriage of the types of the story that's actually telling, these kind of lawless teens with too much time on their hands, too much freedom, that get themselves into a lot of trouble, mixed with the kind of energetic, fast-moving camera work, makes sense to these characters, so it helps us really kind of engage with the story, because we feel like we're the fourth person in the car beside them, going from one thing to the next, not thinking about a lot of things, just doing lots of action. This is also a movie that is taking a different approach to coming of age. Some movies like Breakfast Club or Stand By Me, kind of middle class type movies, are relatively standard in their camera work because the storylines themselves are kids of boredom or just just discovering things, but it's much more lackadaisical. But then this approach to youth is much less curious and much more like these are loose animals that, if not in school, are kind of people with too much freedom and too much agency and they haven't matured enough, so they kind of just ultimately wreak havoc. And that's, like I mentioned, a similar approach to someone like a Harmony Korine for a movie like Kids, for example. But it's not necessarily bad or good. It's just a different type of youth and coming of age, of a different type of world. And the world also feels true and genuine of these, kind of underground, I guess, type youth who have to either sell their body or get into gangs or, just steal. They're kind of surviving one day to the next. And I don't think it's a sympathetic necessarily portrait of it. It's more so a realistic portrait of it. And that's why the kind of fast, frenetic camera work really works well to help us engage so much within this world. So as a result, we get a very interesting, grounded, realistic, dirty sense of these people, these characters, this world, as matched with this camera work. Ultimately, I think, though, to tell kind of that if there is a thematic underlying within this movie, it's about the kind of poor trying to become rich or trying to get themselves a better life and trying to get almost a cheat or an easy way out, and then kind of being some negative consequences, I guess you would say, result in different ways to all the different characters for their kind of attempts to make themselves and forge their own identity. It's a story about someone trying to create their own identity going wrong because of that kind of lack of guidance that they have within their life. So it's a tragic story, but it's also an exciting, fun story because of that frenetic camera work. I don't think everybody would love this movie, but I wanted to cover this movie because I really enjoyed it. Maybe it's because I'm a young man myself, but also I think it's a perfect kind of little bit of a movie within the full arc of this series, because when we're talking about movies that are more than Kurosawa, this is definitely a case. A realistic, grounded, intense look at the Japanese youth of the kind of criminal outside system that they're living within. A classic example that when it comes to Asian cinema, there is more than Kurosawa. But that's about it, guys. I hope you enjoyed the video. Make sure you comment below. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this movie. If you've seen it, if you're excited to see it, if you have any other suggestions of filmmakers that you want to see me cover, we're going to try to be a little bit more obscure. We're not going to cover the big names, but if there's any sort of filmmakers that you love from other different types of countries, I'd love to hear that, and I definitely would consider covering that in the future, because we've got still only halfway or so through the series. We're going to keep on going this series throughout the entire summer before we get back into Old's Oscar Countdown back in October, which of course is the flagship series and will be fun, but we're having a lot of fun with this series right now, so please do engage if you have any suggestions. But that's about it. Until next time, stay tuned.